Okay, let me do this again. So after a false start, all kidding aside, technology is driving me crazy. The way of making these broadcasts is certainly a challenge for all those of us who are, just trying to keep abreast of all these technological innovations and the need to put all this hardware and software together to reach you. This is part of my series Enseñanzas a Distancia, Teachings at a Distance, with which I'm trying to, hold conversations about all kinds of subject matter that I'd like to share with people to try and, educate each other. And when I say each other, this is not a one-way conversation. I expect you to engage, get involved, and certainly ask questions and comment on what we're doing. And today, the subject of this particular broadcast is very interesting to bring a friend of mine from many years. He is an African American and ex-police officer of the NYPD. His name is Tommy Howell. And I think it was very appropriate to bring him in to speak a little bit. A lot of the things that we've spoken as friends before, to share them with you folks out there. And because I think it's important that we have a dialogue about what's going on with the systemic racism, the demonstrations, the whole Floyd incident, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, here we go again. Sorry about that, Tommy, but now you are on the air.
Excellent.
So say hi.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you, Ernesto.
So let's go back to explaining a little bit about your trajectory from beat cop, which where you were when we met in college, all the way to detective, and like I say, the protector of the stars. So you're the Black Kevin Costner. Come on.
Yeah.
So just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your trajectory.
Greetings, everyone. I just want to say I'm happy Ernesto asked me to do this. We have these conversations over the past many years as we sat around and maybe had a glass of wine and talked about how the world is. And Ernesto asked me to come on and have a conversation with him. So that's what we're doing. Just give you a little background on who I am. Born and raised in the Bronx. I'm 58 years old. Became a New York City police officer at the age of 21 and had a very storied career. I've had a blessed career. I started in the Central Bronx working as a street cop. And from there, I went into what was called the Organized Crime Control Bureau, investigating auto theft, working undercover, things like that. Did that for 4 years, and then I ended up in the Intelligence Division, where I was a bodyguard for the mayor of the city of New York, the first African-American mayor of the city of New York, David Dinkins. Worked with him during his one term. And after he's lost the election to Rudolph Giuliani, I stayed on in the Intelligence Division and did some gang intelligence investigations. While I was there, learned a lot of different things about the gangs of New York, as you can say, that were existent in the early 90s. Left there and went to the Brooklyn District Attorney's office and worked in the Brooklyn District Attorney's squad. And from 1997 until 2012, I worked a whole career in that place and ended up being a bodyguard and driver for the district attorney in Brooklyn. During that time, as most cops, many cops do, I worked some side work, and I had the opportunity of working for some celebrities, and that's what I actually do now. I do some private celebrity security for people that you might know, some celebrities, some recording artists, and some bands, and that's who I am. That's what I do. But I'm basically a kid of New York. I'm a kid of the Bronx. I'm a Bronx boy. So That's who I am.
Yeah, I can't help but notice you don't lose hope with the Jets behind you.
Let's go Jets.
Yeah, keep hoping someday before the millennium is over, they
Yeah.
might have a chance. But seriously, okay, so I remember one of the conversations we had months ago
Mhm.
had to do with I ran into the motion picture, and then the subsequent Oprah Winfrey panel about the famous Central Park Five, and then I called you to get your input on it, not realizing that you were closer to that action that I had ever expected.
Well, let me clarify something on that. I was actually not involved in that investigation
Mm-hmm.
at all. I had a then friend who was very involved in the investigation. Um, he was actually a street cop, a plainclothes cop, who made some of the initial arrests in Central Park. His name is Eric Reynolds.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Neither here nor there, but we're no longer friends. That's a whole nother story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Fast forward, as a result of hearing what he told me about the investigation when it was taking place, and then hearing the history of the investigation after the fact, I had a certain perspective on it. So, and we discussed that.
Okay, can you share some?
Absolutely.
Okay, please.
The thing that was the big takeaway for me as a African American, a black kid from the Bronx, was out of all of those five young men who were tried and convicted, only one of which was an adult, considered an adult at the time. There was only one child who had parents who were involved enough to know their rights. I'm a big proponent of knowing your rights. And that was Yusef Salam. Yusef Salam's mother went down to the precinct and said, I'm taking my son home. She was the only one. The other parents, because they weren't aware of their rights, because they were ignorant of their rights, for whatever reason, didn't do that. Yusuf Salam's mother was the one parent who understood, you cannot talk to my child. I will not allow you to talk to my child. You have no legal authority to talk to my child. And, excuse me, she took her son home. Many of the other children under duress, children, kids, teens, whatever you want to call them, under duress, told those detectives what they wanted to hear. They were told, if you tell us what we want to hear, you can go home. Well, people don't like the fact that police lie, but police are allowed to lie in investigations, and people don't understand that. You are allowed to lie to a potential criminal. You can
Mm-hmm.
tell them a story in an effort to get them to confess, in an effort to get them to give you information. And that's basically what happened. They were told, you'll be able to go home if you tell us what we want to know. And unfortunately, they did. They said things about each other that weren't true. Um, and that led to their convictions. Subsequent to that conviction, evidence came out that they were not the ones that were involved in the initial, underline, the initial assault of that woman. I wasn't there. I wasn't privy to the investigative material, but there are tenants that believe and understand that some of them did go and were at the scene where that woman was. Did they rape her? Evidence says that they didn't. Evidence says that there was another young gentleman that raped her. Gentleman, if you want to call him that. A miscreant who raped her. And where the travesty in that case comes about is that there were detectives that knew there was a possibility that this other gentleman, this other guy, was involved in the rape, but they didn't pay attention to it. And that's why there was this plethora, this explosion of attention to the case because of it. But that was all information that I received secondhand
Yeah.
from the former friend of mine and from reading material about the case.
So
The big thing that I want to underline about that was the smarts of Yusef Salam's mother to take her son home and to not allow her son to be questioned. And I started by saying this, but I'm a big proponent of people knowing what their rights are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, ignorance is no excuse. You hear that a lot in the law, but people really need to educate themselves on what their rights are. Many people don't know it. There's one gentleman, I can't remember his name, the Latino kid, who they have a videotape of him confessing to a crime that he didn't do. And his reason for confessing to the crime that he didn't do was so that he could go home. He was under duress. He had been there for hours. And is that type of confession that is forced under duress worthwhile? Is it worthy of any attention? Is it
even admissible? Is it even admissible?
It certainly is admissible if there's no obvious duress that's been placed on them. Mm-hmm. But certainly, just because you lied to someone and told them they could go home, that's not duress. What made it duress was they were there for an exorbitant amount of time. Had that kid's father said, you know what, this interview is over, I'm taking my son home, that would have been the end of it. But they didn't. They stayed there, and they allowed them to squeeze them. And the father said, look, tell them what you got to do. Tell them what they want to hear so I can go to work. I got to go earn a living so we can pay them. And Dad left them there.
Yeah.
That's in evidence. Those are facts.
Yeah.
So,
now, given that obviously, you weren't privy to the facts when they were happening, you weren't, even there or anything like that. But, the first two questions that pop to mind are, number one, especially I've spoken to, some of our friends from New York, like Rob and so on and so forth. And what they tell me is this case in particular got a lot of press because obviously it was the white woman, Central Park, the privilege, very dramatic, Trump getting involved with a full page ad, it became the media circus and so on. But do these kinds of abuses, with people that are suspects and then are forced and shoved into confessions, is that more common than people think?
I believe, from my experience, having worked in a prosecutor's office and having been involved in investigation in cases, I believe that it is far less prominent than people would think. There are cases where this happens. Police officers are human beings and they're prone to doing stupid stuff. I believe that it's far less prominent than people would be led to believe. This case, the Central Park jogger case, which is now called the Central Park 5, was a huge case. Remembering the time frame that we were in the mid to late 80s, crack was just starting to explode, and there was a fear amongst people in New York, especially amongst white people in New York, the fear of the black man. And it was probably every person's fear that this would happen. For years and years and years, we heard about don't go into Central Park, certainly don't go into Central Park at night. And then this thing happened. I want to point out, as you did, that our current president was inflammatory. Took out a full paid ad, get those guys, hang them high. But it wasn't just him. It was the chief executive of the city of New York in addition to that. It was Mayor Ed Koch who was doing that also. It wasn't just Mayor Koch. It was a lot of people calling for, let's get these guys who did this. These kids are out of control. The term wilding was coined as a result of that case. And it was coined because when some of those kids were apprehended, they were asked, what were you doing in the park? And their response was, oh man, we were just in the park, going wild. We were just wilding, acting wild. None of them said that they were there to commit crime, but crimes were committed. If you go over the case and you listen to the 911 calls, there were assaults, there were robberies that were all taking place in the northern end of that park. That's a fact. People were assaulted. People had their bikes attempted to have them stolen. So it was a strange time in New York. It was a weird time. We were transitioning from a city that had just gotten out of a financial crisis in the late 70s, early 70s, and moving into an era where cocaine, rock cocaine had exploded, and crime was really out of control. It was really out of control. And I'd like to point out, not just because I was a bodyguard for David Dinkins, but it is a fact that crime escalated in New York when Ed Koch was mayor. From 1977 to 1990, crime shot through the roof. The mayor walks through the door in 1990 as the first African-American mayor, and it's dropped in his lap that he has this city that's out of control with crime. But revisionist historians would have you believe that it happened all under David Dinkins' watch. It didn't. It happened under Ed Koch. Ed Koch, the guy that everybody loves, crime went from a certain level in 1977 through the roof in 1990. So just a little bit of New York history in there.
So now, fast forward to 2020.
Right.
People are inside a pressure cooker because that's a very interesting analogy for what we're feeling. Inside a pressure cooker, cooked up in the homes with uncertainty, fear, stress. A lot of dynamics going on with families that maybe or couples or relationships that might have survived for a long time because you weren't on top of each other 24/7, and now everybody is put in this pressure cooker. Obviously, you mentioned very wisely that cops are people too, and so they're going through the stresses and everything with additional stress of being out on the street in the middle of pandemic and so on and so forth. Now, this George Floyd incident was the spark. I imagine that in your training for law enforcement and subsequently the thing of putting pressure on somebody's neck for 8 minutes is not exactly in the training manual. Correct me if I'm wrong.
In the 30 years that I was in the New York City Police Department, I was never trained to put a knee on any perpetrator's neck. Never. So I can tell you that is not anything I was ever trained to do.
Mm-hmm. So this explodes into what we've been living in the past few weeks, and I think it was throwing gasoline in a mix of discontent with government, the anxiety that I just mentioned, all these things, planetary conjunctions, whatever you want to call it, is just boom, exploded, and then the whole dynamic takes on a new twist. When, as usual, you have discontented people going out and demonstrating in the streets, and then everybody else expects the demonstrators to have full control of every human being that's out there, as if they had a magic wand, to keep the goons from taking the opportunity to do whatever, to mess with property and so on and so forth. Because, as what happened when the big blackout in New York, as what happened with the storms and every time in Puerto Rico, when Hurricane Maria came, people were burning down Walgreens stores and stealing everything, and nobody said, Maria, see, that's why you can't have hurricanes, because then people start stealing and messing with stuff. I mean, really. But, what's your take on whether systemic racism has to be addressed in the police force? And I know you haven't been there for years, but obviously you keep abreast of this. Is it real? Should it be looked at, handled properly? And what's your take on this whole protest and everything?
Here is my perspective on racism in police departments. Let's start at the foundation. And the foundation is, we live in a racist society. We live in a society that was built on racism. The enslavement less than 200 years ago, right, of another race, the oppression of a people, the fact that these people, that a society can oppress a group of persons based purely on their skin color. That's the foundation of this. Now, is that to say that there are not racist police officers? Hell no, there are racist police officers. There are a good amount of racist police officers. They're out there. We know it. And until recently, most of those racist police officers did not feel emboldened enough to keep their heads above the fray and to show who they are. They pretty much kept themselves undercover, but they were there. In my 30 years, I think I came across a handful of guys who I would say, that's a piece of, pardon my friends, a piece of shit. That guy's a piece of shit. But I knew they were there, and I knew they existed. The guys and the girls that I worked with never showed me that. Not when they were working with me. They knew what would have happened if they did. Now, to that point, are there racist doctors? You damn right there are. Are there racist lawyers? You're damn right there are. Are there racist firemen and everyone else? Yes. Again, going back to the foundation of what our society is built on. What we as a society have to figure out is, how do we weed them out? How do we prevent them from being in a position of executing some of that racism against any person? How do we figure out the best way to minimize, can't eliminate it, but how do we minimize their boldness and ability to execute their racism on people? That's the hardest part. I believe that the foundation of that is in the hiring process. All too often, municipalities suddenly discover we need cops. You didn't know you needed cops 2 years ago. You couldn't project as public administrators the fact that in 3 years you're going to need a new level of cops. When I was becoming a cop, New York City had gone through a financial crisis in the 70s. Cops were laid off. My brother, who was a cop, was laid off. He subsequently got his job back. But there was a period of time where there was a window when police officers, the last big group of police officers before me and a couple of classes, had been hired in 1968. Guys coming back from Vietnam were hired. 20 years later is 1988. Those guys were starting to retire. You mean the police department, the city of New York, didn't realize that attrition was going to take place, that we were suddenly going to be short police officers in 1988 at a time when cocaine and rock cocaine was exploding? They didn't realize that. So in the early 80s, they started to hire cops. I believe it was the class in 1981 was probably the largest police academy class that New York City ever had. A lot of guys I know came out of that class. Huge numbers. They worked around the clock going through the academy. Were there guys that shouldn't have been hired in that group? Probably. There are guys in every group that shouldn't be hired. So I think that if municipalities are serious about doing this, I think one of the biggest things they need to do is enhance the selection and hiring process of police officers. All too often we rush to get numbers. We need another class of 1,500. We need another class of 700. We need another class of 3,000. All because of what's happening in society. In the late 80s, the mid 80s and late 80s, crime was exploding through the Koch years, and everybody got scared. We need more police. Society said, bring back the days of cops on the corner. Where's my local street cop? We need that. We need more cops. Well, you got more cops. Maybe too fast. Maybe we didn't think as public administrators, as government officials, as elected officials, let's really think this down the road. When I'm not up for a re-election, how's it going to be in 8 years when I'm term limited? What am I projecting as far as what's needed for my city? How am I going to be a good administrator for my citizenry? That's really the foundation of all of this, from my humble expectation. At least in the city of New York.
No, but then, excuse me for butting in, but sure. Okay, so obviously there's a filter that should happen, to not let, shall we say, the bad apples. I hate that expression. A few bad apples. It makes me think.
In addition to that, how do you determine what's the bad apple? How do you
Exactly.
figure that out? That's the site. That's the interesting part. That's how do you do that?
But then, okay, once you're in there, or once the bad apple got in there, what's the story with cops not being able to signal out and raise flags when they see one of their brethren, if you will, one of their people from work? And again, like you mentioned, this happens in all kinds of jobs. A lot of people don't want to go in and tell the boss, I really think, Dr. So and so or Nurse Ratchet or whatever, or like you mentioned, is really behaving like an idiot. But the difference here, mind you, is that the person behaving like an idiot has a license to kill and has a weapon, which doesn't happen in many other occupations. So what about that, fraternity that we see in the movies and all that stuff that don't, see nothing, say nothing? What's the story with that?
You're referring to the blue wall of silence.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it exists. Anybody that says it doesn't exist is lying to you. It exists. It exists for right reasons, but it also exists for wrong reasons. I'll give you an example. When I was a young cop, there was a woman in the Bronx, ironically, in a city housing project that I used to live in as a young kid, Sedgwick Houses. Her name was Eleanor Bumpers. She was a emotionally disturbed person, as we call. She was having issues, and the police got. My son is sneezing over there. She was having emotional issues, and she barricaded herself behind her apartment door. Some family member or a neighbor called and said, "Hey, that lady's bugging out in there, and we need the police." Police are called. They respond to the apartment. She says, "If you come through my door, I'm going to stab you and I'm going to throw lye in your face." Okay, so the cops call emergency service, which is like our SWAT team, for lack of a better terminology. They respond with a big plastic shield, a crook, and a shotgun. And the crook is to isolate, it's a big wide piece of metal to isolate the woman. Some of you know this history. In the process of doing that, the woman knocks the crook away and charges at the cops with a knife and attempts to stab the cops. And they shoot her with a shotgun and they kill her. People were incensed, rightfully so. Why did this poor woman have to die? Well, the opposite side of that is we as cops all knew those officers did what they were trained to do with the equipment that they were trained to do it with. One of the cops was indicted and was going to go to trial, or was about to be indicted. I don't remember, the emergency service police officer. And there was a bunch of us that went down to the district attorney's office and had a big, huge rally around the DA's office, Bronx Supreme Court. And it was a weird time because how could you not be upset that this woman was killed? This woman was killed unnecessarily. And unnecessarily is the fact. But did those police officers do anything criminal is the question. The answer is no. They did what they were trained to do, and how their supervisors and how the city fathers and how the penal law and how the Constitution of the state of New York empowered them to do that. Part of the problem is that it's not a problem, it's the circumstance, is that people don't understand what police officers do or why they do it. Like you said before, cops are the only people who are empowered by the Constitution of any given state to be able to end someone's life. That's heavy. It's heavy. Cops don't take that lightly. We don't come into a day and say, yeah, I'm going to take somebody's life today. No cop that I know. No cop that I know is thinking that way. But when faced with a circumstance of it's going to be me or them, what do? Especially if that's the way they've been trained. So yeah, this is a multifaceted situation.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the foundation of better policing is the hiring process, how police officers are hired. The next step is training. I can tell you experience is probably the most important portion of having good street cops. When I came on the job, again, going back to the guys that worked hired from 68 and started retiring in 88, they did their 20 years. I was hired in 83. So I had a bunch of guys who I worked with who had served in Vietnam. They showed me the ropes. I'm a 21-year-old kid, and I'm working with a guy who's 37, 38, 40 years old. He's showing me the ropes. No, we don't do it that way. Those guys checked us. Those are the guys that said, nah, man, you're going a little too far. I had it happen to me. I will tell you a quick story. It's at the beginning of the AIDS crisis. Nobody knew what the hell AIDS was. We knew that certain segments of society were prone to getting AIDS. We didn't even know it was HIV. It was called AIDS, and it was called SLIM and all these other names. Specifically, one community that I'm referring to is the drug abusers, the substance abusers who shot heroin. So we get a call, and the woman is in the Central Bronx, and she says, again, another mental health call that says, my daughter is in the room. She's barricaded herself in the room. She doesn't want to come out. She's a heroin abuser, and I think she has AIDS. Can you come get her out? So now we're charged with the responsibility of going there and bringing her to the hospital, but she doesn't want to come willingly. I'm not coming out. I'm not coming out. So the supervisor called, again, emergency service, the guys that come with the shotgun and the crook and the shield. And we go into the room without the shotgun and the shield, and we grab the woman. She's laying on the bed, and we turn her over in an attempt to get her handcuffed. She's splaying about. She's not going willingly. I physically have her shoulder in her head, and I'm holding it down. And my concern was that she would spit on me and that I would end up getting AIDS. Mm-hmm. Ignorant of what AIDS was at the time, I held her head down, and I held her head down, and I kept it down so that she couldn't spit on me. I held it down too long. The emergency service cop tapped me on the shoulder, and he says, it's okay. You can let her up. Let her up. Safely let her up. I could have killed that woman. I could have suffocated that woman out of fear that she might have done me harm. I think about that often. I think about how my fear of that circumstance led me to maybe go a little too far in holding her head down. Thank God I didn't suffocate her. I didn't want to. Anyway, good result. She was taken to the emergency room. She went in for psychological evaluation, and we were out of it. But that could have gone the other way. Mm-hmm. I could have suffocated that woman in that pillow in an attempt to keep myself safe. I tell that story. I've told my kids that story. I've told my son, who is also a police officer now in another state, the exact same thing. This is my other son who's down south as a cop. Mm. So, yeah, man, we're human and mistakes are made. With regards to racism, before, years ago, like I said before, maybe racist cops didn't rear their ugly head as willfully or as easily as they are doing now. Racism in the police department has always existed, as it has existed throughout society. Those are facts. Mm-hmm. So I give you that little quick story about how a police officer thinks in the moment, because that's how I was thinking in that moment. I certainly didn't go to work that day with an intention of potentially suffocating a woman. But what I will tell you is the cop who tapped me on the shoulder and said, that's enough, he did the right thing.
Yeah, he broke the blue wall, literally.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the context of making me realize how I was going too far at that point. Having said that, the real issue with the blue wall is when we circle the wagons, because we feel, like a lot of society feels, that we're being
singled out.
Not aimed at.
Yeah.
That, oh, he could go to jail for having done his job, Yeah,
and one of the things that, since you brought out special services and SWAT and all this is this thing, one of the I just want to add that one of the big words that are being thrown around now, and that's caused all kinds of silly reactions, some serious reactions as well, is the expression about defunding the police, and everybody thinks that means suddenly no police anywhere and everybody go crazy. Whereas you just gave a prime example about, first of all, the epidemic of mental problems in the United States, and how a lot of the issues that happen with violence, with all of these issues, have to do with misconceptions about mental health, the stigma that there is around one looking for help for mental health, because you can say everything you want, but if you have cancer, there's no problem with you going to the doctor. But if you're feeling low, if you're feeling alone, whatever, there's still a stigma about saying, I'm going to see a therapist, I need help. Right. Number two, the people that should have taken action there, maybe it was not special services, maybe it wasn't even the cops, maybe there has to be a special task force of people that know how to unplug these kinds of high voltage situations, because they are trained with mental health issues. And that's what they mean by, now I'm not for it, against it, I think it needs to be spoken about, discussed, but that's what they mean by defund, is to move away the responsibility of cops to be mental therapists.
Let me tell you something about that. Let me give you my opinion, and I will tell you that I can guarantee you that 99% of the police officers in New York City, retired, active, will feel exactly what I'm saying and agree with me. The majority of the assignments that uniformed police officers in any local precinct handle have to do with mental health and alcohol and drug abuse. Whether those things filter into family disputes, which are the worst situations for any police officer to get into, or whether they filter into automobile accidents, or whether they filter into robbery or burglary, those three things have everything to do with what a police officer deals with on a daily basis. Having said that, society has always hired police officers to do the shit that nobody else wants to do. I am a proponent. If that's what they mean by defunding the police, I'm all for it. Hire more social workers. Assign those social workers to precincts. Have those social workers respond to the emotionally disturbed person who's barricaded inside their apartment. Have them respond to the emotionally disturbed person that's on the roof threatening to jump. Why do cops have to do it? I can guarantee you that if the New York City police officers, every single New York City police officer would say, please do that. We don't want to respond to these cases. We don't want to respond to people threatening to jump off of bridges. We don't want to respond to people who are having family disputes because of A or B. Quick story. I worked with a female when I was in the precinct. I'm not astute on this at all, and you're going to be amazed at this story. The call was a family dispute. It's always on the 6th floor of the apartment building that has no elevator. We go to the family dispute, open the door. Guy says, officers, I'm so glad you're here. Big strapping gentleman stands there. He has a knife on his belt. My partner, the female, says, take that knife off and give it to me while we're here. What's going on? He starts to talk to us. He says, I don't know. I'm sick and tired of what's happening between my wife and my stepdaughter. They're fighting constantly. We look into the living room, and there is a teenage girl with a black eye, right? The mother's in the kitchen washing the dishes, and she's got her back to us. He says, I'm sick of these two women. They're constantly fighting. I can't take it. I continue to talk to him. My female partner goes and talks to the mother. I then see the mother and the female officer go to talk to the daughter. Turn the corner. I'm still talking to this guy. At that time, I'm thinking, oh, this is just a family dispute between mother and daughter. Who the hell knows what it's about? But my partner is in the process of finding out. Suddenly, my partner comes running over and grabs this guy by the throat and says, if you ever touch your stepdaughter again, I'll come back here and I will beat your ass. You know what the case was? The stepfather was sexually abusing the stepdaughter. And the mother thought that the stepdaughter was enticing the father, the husband. And so she punched the daughter in the eye. What person could ever have figured that out? Why do police officers have to deal with that? That is purely a social service issue. That is a sexual abuse case between a stepfather and a teenage daughter who may have been of age. She might have been 16 or older, but nonetheless, I'm 22 years old cop coming in trying to figure this out, and I have to solve their problems. So I say that social workers should be out. They should be hiring more social workers. For every 3 cops, they should hire 1 social worker.
And allow
but
me.
You know what the problem is with that? The city of New York and municipalities won't do that because it costs too much to pay for social workers. They have secondary education. They would demand more money in salary. So again, it goes back to the city fathers and the administrators to do that. But I guarantee you, every single cop I know would love not having to respond to family disputes, would love not having to respond to emotionally disturbed persons cases. They would love to fight crime. Cops would love to fight people who are robbing people, people who are stealing cars, who are burglarizing stores and burglarizing apartments. Why do cops have to handle social service issues? Hire social workers.
And by the way, there's every single logic tells you that drug addiction problems are mental health problems to begin with.
Absolutely. And alcoholism too.
And so all the crime built around drug distribution, sales, etc., is a symptom of the problem with mental health in a country that doesn't appreciate or doesn't put emphasis on mental health professionals from when you're a baby or even before you're born.
Want the quick fix, Ernesto.
Exactly.
Society wants a quick fix. And the quick fix is send in the troops, squash the problem until that squashing becomes a problem.
So speaking of babies and the segue that I promised you I was going to make, I want to bring in your baby, one of your babies, your middle kid, Russell, into the conversation. And the reason I want to bring you in is because you and I spoke about, and I've seen on the news and in in documentaries and stuff, the whole conversation about the talk.
Hold on, I dropped my earphone. There we go. We're good.
Okay, the talk, which is absurdly so. It's an assumption between African American families. I can't say for how long. I imagine it comes, it starts in the slavery era when you learn, who dominates and who has to be subjugated to that authority. But we speak about it, we mention it, and I've never had somebody tell me actually how the heck did your dad, Russell, suddenly sit with you one day and say, "Son, we have to have the talk." How did that start? And what did what was the talk about? I've heard about it, but I've never heard the talk,
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it was like a definitive moment in time, like a singular moment. It was more of a constant, I'd say, drilling into my head is the kind of word that I like to use, of just constantly repeating things. Like one of the things is my brother and I used to play with airsoft guns. Which are little plastic guns, that shoot plastic BBs. And he always made sure, he's like, don't remove that orange tip. And if you ever see a police car, make sure you just put the thing down. If the cop approaches you, you like back away from it and say this is a toy, not a gun, and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Let me just tell you a quick side on that. So, Call of Duty, all of these video games, they're playing them on the computer, and it's all about the American soldier. They're children that grew up post 9/11, pre 9/11, war, get the enemy, just like we grew up in the Vietnam era. We fought, we played with G.I. Joes. That's their upbringing. in the midst of all of that, we have other things happening with guns and people's attention to guns. I grew up playing with toy guns. Other kids earlier than us grew up playing cowboys and Indians. The gun is American. We know that. But I know that my children are Black. And in that context, my job is to make sure that they live, that they survive. So that's why I reiterated to them, yeah, go out and play like you're the American soldier. There's nothing wrong with that. Go out and be an American hero, but know that you are a young Black man, and someone with a bias could misconceive what you are doing. Funny.
Our neighbors.
Our neighbors. Our neighbors, not our current neighbors. It was neighbors before. One day, this is before we had bushes between the houses, the husband stood up and saw the kids dressed in camouflage. They had ghillie suits. They used to have little mini wars out here. They're real country boys. They'd have little mini wars out. And
Andrew brought the lawnmower into the woods at one point.
Yeah, to build a fort
tank or something.
He thought he took the lawnmower, the riding tractor, into the woods as if he was driving, a tank. The neighbor stood up and looked and made a face like, and his wife later on spoke to my wife and said, "You let your sons play with guns?" I mean, it was that kind of comment. How could you let your sons play with guns? She goes, "What are you talking about? It's okay to send them to war, but they can't play with guns?" So
fake guns.
They were toy guns, but it's a mentality. It's a thought process. I had someone else say to me, "Oh, are they acting like they're gangbangers?" And I said, "No, they're not acting like they're gangbangers. They're American patriots fighting a war against the enemy. How is the two the same?" Anyway, that's my aside.
Yeah, and hello, we've all played gangbangers when we're little because somebody has to be the bad guy, and somebody has to be the good guy. But in this case, it has some very nasty implications. I remember at one point at Woolworths. I don't know if anybody remembers the store called Woolworths, and I just dated myself very seriously. But okay, but at Woolworths, and my brother and I actually purchased exact replicas of M1 Garand rifles from World War II with the bolt action and everything functional. They were so freaking realistic. Years later, I'm much older and maybe too old for what I'm going to say, but I purchased a set of plastic guns to do laser tag, and those were exact replicas of 9mm Berettas. Undistinguishable. The whole thing with painting toy guns in fluorescent orange and that stuff came about after, I don't know how many kids got shot because of I mistook that for a real gun. But now the real guns are being painted in fluorescent green and
colors
and red. So but the whole concept of, because you're talking about you're acting out there, you're playing blah blah. But Russell, have you ever actually experienced just hanging out or driving or whatever and getting stopped, for whatever reason? And were you forced to act in a way that I don't know if you can even imagine that, but do you feel that you were compelled to act in a different way than every other human being?
I guess I'll point to one time I was on I-76, which goes into Philadelphia, with my two friends in the car. And it was pretty close traffic, so there's a car really close behind me, and I don't know if it's just because I like cars or whatever, but I'm really good at picking out when there's a cop car, even if it's if it's an undercover cop car. And I was like, this guy behind us is a cop, and he's riding my ass. And immediately, I'm kind of like an anxious person at times, so I was immediately like, oh, is this guy gonna pull me over or whatever? And I switched lanes, so maybe he wants to get behind me, turns on his lights. I'm like, oh, he's pulling me over. And my friends are like, why is he pulling us over? We were doing 50, not even near 65 because of the traffic. And yeah, I mean, I had to drive a bit. I'm probably getting too much into detail right now, but drive a bit because there was no shoulder. And the first thing the officer did when he went up to the window was like, why did you pull over as soon as he had like a kind of angry demeanor. So I was like, oh, why is this guy like this? But he's like, why don't you immediately pull over? And I was like, well, I was trying to be courteous and give you space because I know it's dangerous to be out on the side of the road. But in terms of how I act when I'm pulled over, I guess a term that I kind of have coined in my head is like, you just have to drop your ego and I'm just, I turn into very mechanical. I'm like, I turn on, even it could be middle of the day, turn on the lights. I don't even reach around before the cop rolls up. I just turn on the lights, hands on the wheel, and just wait for the cop to get there, roll down the window, and how are you doing, officer, blah, blah, blah. And then I do have, and I know this has been a topic of controversy a little bit, but not a PBA card,
get a courtesy card.
Courtesy card from my dad.
Police courtesy card.
And I always make sure to say, hello, hey, how's it going, blah, blah, blah. Just wanted to let you know my father was in the NYPD for 30 years, so on and so forth.
It's the get out of jail free card.
Yeah.
No, what?
I think as soon as I hand that over, most of the time they kind of don't flip, I would say, but after that I haven't really had a super negative moment with the cop, luckily, thankfully.
And if you order those cards now at 1-800 call Tommy, then we can.
Wow.
Exactly.
On eBay, you can find them on sale on eBay, believe it or not.
So
They're useless now.
The flip side of this is, I remember I was in the middle of a row with one of my many ex-spouses, and I was driving. I was angry. I was frustrated, and I was driving in that condition, talking to her on the phone. So I line up to the curb in the middle of nowhere in Puerto Rico, and I'm sitting there, yelling and yapping, etc. And suddenly, I didn't even notice somebody taps in my window, and when I look to my left, there's this huge cop there with a shotgun in his hand. I lower the window and I said, "¿Qué le pasa?" It's the guy, and the cop looked like, you remember Mr. Smith in The Matrix? Yes. When Neo confronts him at the end and the guy takes 2 steps back. Well, it was exactly, the cop just went like this. And he said, "Sorry, sir, we were just, worried about..." This is a guy with a shotgun.
Shotgun, right.
I imagine if my skin tone would have been closer to this than to this, the reaction would have been slightly different. And my only other similar experience was years ago. We were shooting, videotaping a commercial in the boondocks. Lights went out. We're in the middle of darkness, and some of the crew left the key inside the vehicle. And we had to call the cops and blah blah, and waiting for them. And I said, are these guys really going to believe that this is our vehicle and so on and so forth? And my friend turns out to me and says, "Ernesto, with that noble disposition that you have, do you think that a cop is going to doubt anything that you say?" And again, it didn't register to me, what he was saying, and we're up to the hour. And I want to end on this note. First of all, thank you guys.
I appreciate it, but let me just say one last thing.
Sure.
The talk, which is where we were going on the end with my son, is really important for people to understand who don't understand what the talk is. I got the talk. I think every black kid gets the talk. If you have a responsible parent, they're going to make sure that they give their child the talk. And as Russell indicated, it wasn't a sit down moment and let me tell you how, the birds and the bees kind of thing. It's a steady, continuous reinforcement of information on how to survive. The same way I would teach my child and talk to my child, make sure you stop at the stop sign and look both ways before you cross the street. It's very similar to that. When I was a kid growing up in the West Bronx in the 60s, I was always taught, don't run from the police. There was a bunch of kids, a bunch of people who would run from the police and would get shot in the back then. So this shooting in the back is nothing new. It's been happening for decades. I was told, do not ever run from the police. If the police want to stop you, let them stop you. If they tell you to put your hands up, put your hands up. Do not ever fight with the police. You never win. Nobody's ever won fighting the police. So why would you ever fight with the police? Don't run, don't fight, and most importantly, don't mouth off to the cops.
Drop your ego.
Lose your ego and don't mouth off to the cops. And so the question was, why would they tell you that? Which is where the talk is. What's the question about? Why would they tell you that? Because they want you to live. They want you to survive. They don't want you at the least to get a fat lip or a black eye because the cop punched you in the face. They want you to survive the encounter. And that's what I taught my children, all three of them. Survive the encounter. When I coached Little League, I told the kids the same way. Don't run from the cops. Talk to the cops. Be polite as you can be. Now, that could be perceived as cowering to authority. Yeah, you're damn right, it's cowering to authority. Yeah. It is, but you go home at the end of the night. The same way cops are told that their job, their top priority when they go to work is to go home to their families at the end of the night. Any black boy or girl's job is to go home to their family at the end of the night. That's the talk. And it's not a sit down and it's not one event. It's a series of reinforcements over time as they are becoming adults, as they're raising your children to know how to deal with finances, the same way you learn teaching your children how to properly have proper health care and personal care, brush your teeth this way. It's all the same thing. It's all part of that. That's what the talk is. How to survive healthy.
And perhaps a lot of those rules could very well apply to people that are not black. Especially the one recommendation I would add to that is, if you reach that level of engagement with the police, do not say a single thing.
Boom. That's where we started.
Nothing.
That's where we started. I want my lawyer.
Nothing. O sea, nada. It was on me. I wasn't there.
If you're a child, if you're 16 in New York State, if you're 16 or under, they can't question you without having an adult present, which is where we started this conversation. Yusef Salam's mother knew that. You can't talk to my child without me present. So don't talk to my child. You must teach your children, black, white, whatever color you are. If you are stopped by the police, you say nothing. You say, I want my lawyer. That's across the board to everyone. Anybody that doesn't do that is not teaching their children properly. Sorry, officer, I have nothing to say. I want my lawyer. Or if you're a juvenile, I want my mother or father. I want my parent.
Excelente. So, Tommy, I want to thank you. Russell, I appreciate it. Your candor, you sharing with us. Fantastic conversation. I hope that this is the first of many dialogues that we can have together and we can have with other people. It is so necessary to speak, about these issues nowadays. And now that we're cooped up, we have less excuses to find the time to engage in this type of dialogue. And I hope that eventually peace will settle upon the land, at least temporarily, and that each one of us does our part to maintain that peace, to listen, to tolerate, and to not be scared, angry, or just simply mad at somebody because they look different than you. And of course, and if you have mental issues, especially now, depression, loneliness, feelings of destructive feelings towards anybody in your circle or towards yourself, by all means, feel the need, feel to call somebody for help, even if it's a friend at first, but professional. There is no stigma in working with yourself and growing and developing your mind, sound health, and mental health. So thank you very much, dudes. I appreciate. Un abrazo bien fuerte a tu esposa. that was there earlier with us. And man, thank you very much. We'll see you
Thank
later.
you. Peace.
Yep.
Hey, wear a mask.